It is a real pleasure to be involved with this symposium, and I'm very much looking forward to the speakers this afternoon. I am a devoted admirer of Persepolis, although it's not been the focus of my own research yet. And one of the reasons for this devotion is because of the sort of endless layers of questions, of perspectives, of complexity of thinking that this site not only accommodates, but in fact requires. And surely we will see some of that today. While my own research hasn't focused on Persepolis, the site does feature in almost every class that I teach. From a course on ancient kings and kingship to interrogations of the idea of portraiture and its application to pre-modern contexts, to a first-year course on archaeology and nationalism. In the few minutes that I have before I introduce our first two speakers, then, I'd like to describe the ways, some of the ways anyway, that Persepolis has been a site of exploration to my students. Following Gallatin's model and my own way of teaching, and admittedly risking a little bit of rhetorical redundancy, I focus on questions rather than answers. The questions that Persepolis opens and the discussions that it has prompted indicate, I think, just how complex and compelling it is, even to those who are encountering it for the first time, through slides and images, and from the vastly distant context of the New York City classroom. Now, because I am an art historian who's particularly interested in the communicative capacity of imagery, the reliefs of the Apadana and of the nearby royal tombs are frequently my way in to the site of Persepolis. These reliefs are the foundation for many class discussions around the visualization of empire. The Apadana famously depicts the various peoples, there they are, under Achaemenid rule, led in procession and bearing tribute. They are depicted with what appears to be ethnographic precision. They differ in dress, hair, and sometimes physiognomic detail, and they bring with them material goods reflective of their specific contribution to the diverse imperial economy. These reliefs and related images from the royal tombs that show similar diverse figures literally supporting the image of the king suggest an empire of peaceful participation and cooperation, of unity forged under and through divinely sanctioned Achaemenid leadership. What is the thinking and the appeal of this image of empire? What is the importance of understanding a constructed image of empire or of any political hegemony, even as we acknowledge that the reality was much more complicated? To be sure, these reliefs offer a dramatic contrast to, for instance, the Assyrian palace emphasis on overwhelming violent military victory, even if the Achaemenids do demonstrate their martial might elsewhere. In my class on kings and kingship, we consider the potential aims and strategies that underlie these different emphases. We talk, too, about the multivalence of imagery, what various audiences may be, and who may be privy to what meanings. The differences among the people of the Apadana are situated within an overall pattern of visual regularity, and this orderly diversity was clear to most or even all viewers. But surely the details were meaningful to many fewer. Who are these people? What is gained from the visual distinction between, say, Saka and Bactrians? Is there a discernible organizing principle to their inclusion or their position in the reliefs? Who is included, who is left out, and to what ends? Is it fair to treat this as an ethnography? Specificity suggests to us accuracy in the objective or scientific way that we have come to define it. And it's possible that this operated in some kind of similar way in its original context. An accumulation of detail suggests, in any case, authoritative knowledge. But is accuracy a concern here? Can we even assume that a visiting Syrian, for instance, would recognize the Syrian delegation? Or is that beside the point? Is there anything that we can learn from the reliefs about the people that made up the empire or about the procession itself? How, further, do we think about different modes of viewing in the ancient context? The Apadana and the palace reliefs generally require a process of viewing as the visitor moves physically through space. It is a mode of viewing that is either fragmented, all right, with individual images pieced together or not in the visitor's mind, or it's fluid, continuously unfolding. What are the effects of linking viewing so closely to bodily movement? How did the changing perspectives, the changing proximities, the emergence and recession of detail, the sheer overwhelming volume and scale of image, together with architecture, how do these shape the viewing experience and the effect of space? In my course on ancient portraits, we focus on the image of the Achaemenid king, here shown in an audience scene from one of the door jambs of the throne hall. In what is a common thread throughout this course, we ask whether our modern expectations of likeness can be applied here. Or is this, as Irene Winter has argued of Assyrian images of kings, a portrait of the office of kingship? If that question is answered in the positive, what are the values of kingship that such an image communicates? And how does this correspond to or expand upon the image of empire communicated in something like the Apadana reliefs? In my course on archaeology and nationalism, we look at the site of Persepolis alongside other case studies like the Parthenon in Greece, the First Emperor's Tomb in China, and the Brothertown indigenous settlement in Wisconsin. In the Persepolis case study, we consider the various periods of excavation and preservation as highlighting the tensions and coexistence of colonial reach and of the delineation of national identity. These case studies provide a way of interrogating not just the particulars of these examples, but also the deep dependence of modern identities on historical narrative, even while the function of those narratives vary by context. Because of its tactility, material culture is especially effective in making the past present. And we think carefully about the ways in which archaeology has been both crucial to the construction of narratives of power and essential for uncovering alternatives to those narratives. There are many other issues, too, that I don't even have time to ask questions about. Persepolis' identity as an imperial capital, its relationship to the four corners of the empire, the ritual identity of the site, the relationship of it and of the procession represented to the real economies and administration of the empire, the correlation of text and image at the site, in reliefs and in the fortification archives, the symbolic maintenance of imperial productivity through the palace gardens, the craftsmen and craftsmanship of the palace's long construction. I am sure that our speakers today will offer further perspectives and avenues for thinking about this quite complicated, quite nuanced site. Allow me to introduce then both of the speakers for our first session, Ancient Persepolis and its Rediscoveries. Alexander Nagel is assistant professor in the Department of Art History at SUNY's FIT, Fashion Institute of Technology, teaching courses on ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean art and sustainability and environment in the ancient world. And he is a residential research associate with an office in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. It's quite a mouthful, just a lot of things. Alex is actively involved in research and publication of materials and archaeological sites in Iran at Persepolis and Susa, and at Stratos in Greece. In addition to his work at the Smithsonian Institution, he has worked on research projects and exhibitions at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, the National Museum in Tehran, and the Louvre's Achaemenid Persia Research Project, Achaemenet. In his work, he interrogates anthropological and archaeological fieldwork and works with Iranian scholars on collaborative projects. His talk today will be on builders, sculptors, and painters on an archaeological site in Iran, circa 520 to 330 BCE. Our second speaker is Daniel Potts, professor of ancient Near Eastern archaeology and history at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at New York University. Prior to joining NYU in 2013, he held the Edwin Cuthbert Hall Chair of Middle Eastern Archaeology at the University of Sydney for 22 years. And before that, he taught at both the University of Copenhagen and the Free University in Berlin. Educated at Harvard, he works mainly on ancient Iran. He speaks to us today on the power of Persepolis, from Sabur Sakhn-Shah to Cornelis de Braun. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Alexander Nagel.
Salam, good afternoon. Thank you so very much for the invitation. It is a great honor to speak here in front of such a crowded audience. Thank you very much, Matt, for the invitation, for Lucy, for Ali also for having me here. Thank you, Hallie, for this very kind introduction. I want to start actually because we are now this week actually in a very interesting time period here in America also, with an Iranian who was visiting New York City in 1888. He sends a comment back to the Shah, and he writes in this comment, "All the people are alert, intelligent, learned, polite, and wealthy in America. Women in this country are no different from men in their training and work. All government dignitaries are vague earners and servants of the people, and if they commit a violation, the people dismiss them. There are even 2 black slaves among the congressmen." This was the word of Haj Hossein Qoli Khan Mohammed al-Waisara in 1888. What I will do this afternoon is to try to explain to you how I understand Persepolis and the buildings on this site. It is a vast site, so a very complex site also, like Hallie already addressed. So we are going to take a flight over Iran now, and we are about 14 hours away from Tehran if we go by today by bus. And we have also 2 other sites that will feature from time to time in my presentation, Susa, also in Iran, and the site of Babylon, which we have in Persepolis. This is in Iraq, I'm sorry, which is related also to a very recent discovery that was made in Persepolis. So these 2 other sites, Susa and Babylon, will also feature in this presentation. Iran, the Achaemenid Persian Empire in its extent, as we know today, as you see in the small little map up here, reached from northern Africa, from Libya up to what is modern India, Pakistan, so stretched afar also regions in the north, in what is Turkey, modern Turkey, and Turkmenistan even higher up. So it's a very vast empire that we are dealing obviously with. And today when you go to cities like Isfahan, when you visit these sites, they are full of blue and of gold, impressions of yellow, green. These are also the predominant colors that I found in my research in Persepolis since 2006. I will talk about the research that I've been doing there, how it got to there in a few minutes. But I want to remind you also that Iran is this beautiful country today, so full of monuments really from much later periods also that we should also look into if we study the ancient Persian monuments. There is no way that you cannot look also at what happened later actually, and it helps us also to understand a little bit what was going on there. And here we have an image of Shiraz, a city that has also it's very near, close by to Persepolis actually today. So it's only about a 1.5-hour bus ride from Shiraz to Persepolis, and the birthplace of, or the place of Hafiz and all of these famous Persian people that we know. Only about 2 weeks ago in Shiraz, the German Goethe Institute had a celebration of field work of Germans in Iran. Since the 1930s. And so this exhibition 2 weeks ago featured a few photographs that were taken by one particular German who worked there. Ernst Herzfeld is his name, and we will come back to him in the 1930s. So he was pretty much featured in this exhibit and still hangs over a lot of research we do today in Persepolis, and you will understand why, hopefully, after my talk. So Persepolis here in an aerial view. The most comprehensive book about Persepolis, if you want to read more about the site, is written by Ali Moussavi. Fantastic compilation of all the research that has been done here on this site, what we know today about the monuments. And so this was, for me, also a very eye-opening, actually, volume when it was published a few years ago into the Iranian side again. So because Ali's father worked at Persepolis also, so he has first-hand knowledge of everything that happened there. I've been working now on the site since 2006. What I've been trying to do is documenting paint, documenting gilding, evidence for the workmen that we have still preserved on the surface of the monument. So you see, for instance, these giant so-called lamassus, and we will come back to them, that were at the entrance gate. When you go with the crane on top of it, this is unfortunately how it looks like on top today. So it needs a little bit of cleaning, but it will be done. So I mean, there is a lot of field work going on also on the site in Persepolis by people who work in conservation there. So and this is basically they allowed me to have access to the site. There's a wonderful team in Persepolis of workmen there who preserve the site as a touristic site, so you need to take care also of the many visitor streams that come there on a daily basis. What I want to do in this next 30 minutes is to talk a little bit about the research that I've been doing also on archives. So I have, in addition to the work that I've been doing on the site with several teams that I will also introduce, I have been spending lots of time looking into older letters and to correspondence also that was shared between the people who were working on the site with scholars around the world. So there is quite a bit of archival research also that goes into this. I broke my presentation into 3 parts. First, I will talk about a term, image makers, that appears throughout in inscriptions that we have in the Persian Empire. In the second part, I will talk about a particular project that I started because we have paint balls that were found actually on the site of the painters that were painting there in 2,500 years ago, the walls of many of these facades that we see today in gray. So this is the second part of my presentation, and then I will conclude in a few words. So the most recent structure around Persepolis that is currently actually being excavated, we will talk about this too, is actually not too far away from Persepolis. We have here an aerial view. This is from a map that was done by an Iranian, Italian, French team. The project is called From Town to Palace. That's a project that's been running now for a good 10 years in Iran, and they are trying to understand the surroundings of the site of Persepolis during this time in the 6th century BCE, so that we understand also how this monumental site came all together there. So the star that you see here, this is the site of Takht-e-Jamshid. This is the heart of the very place we are talking about today in Persepolis, but there are other monuments around and sites that indicate that many more places here were actually settled and were occupied for this time, also during the time of Darius, Xerxes, and all of these rulers whom we know. So one particular site, Firuzi Sud, is which I will come later to, and then we have Nakhja-Rustam very far in the north here, which is obviously the place where the Persian rulers, Darius, Xerxes, and 2 more rulers were buried. And so it was always a close relationship between what happened in Persepolis, in Takht-e-Jamshid, on the site here, Quartier Royal, and the surrounding areas. So Nakhja-Rustam, here you have an aerial view of these giant tomb structures that were carved here into the mountains. Yeah. So also not too far away from and Persepolis and Nakhja-Rustam is Pasargad, another site that I will briefly also come to, the place where Cyrus the Great is buried today. You have seen lots of images. I do not need to introduce this today. all around the Sivand River. This is the river that goes through many of these places also that we see. So to give you a background of chronology, we are talking here about the late 6th century to the mid 4th century BCE, and the the people I have highlighted in yellow here, Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes, are the ones whom we have lots of knowledge about in terms of building activities on the site, particularly Darius and Xerxes, because we have plenty of tablets that refer to the ongoing work under their rulership on the site. So just for those who are more from the classical period, I have this a nice picture running parallel here, the Parthenon, which was constructed between 447 and 432. So you see it almost is contemporary with Artaxerxes, the first world. Closer to Persepolis, again, we have Takht Jamshid here. There are a few structures that have now been found in geomagnetic surveys by the French, Iranian, Italian team. Persepolis West has evidence here for some workmen quarters also. And there are several other complexes. So this has been published already quite well in the last couple of years. And here we have the actual Takht Jamshid. And here is this place where the 1971 celebrations were held. And there are still the tents of these big festivals that we will maybe hear later about preserved. So we have also evidence actually for burning that was going on here in the 4th century BC around the Takht, the Persepolis structure itself. Buildings in the south have been excavated, and some of them actually still show the beams, the wooden beams that were falling from the roof onto these parts that are still in stone. We have also calcination on the terrace complex from these giant roofs that were made out of wood and fell down onto these structures. The site itself, so here we have a ground plan, and I will often talk, and Heli already referred to it, to the Apadana. This is this very large structure that you see here. I will also briefly comment on the of the Hall of the 100 Columns in this area, and you've seen the gate already that I briefly had shown, which is situated here. Early on photographed, so these photographs here from the early 20th century show how people then, how the site was really isolated then, and so people first discovered it back, and you see these photographs that were taken here by Germans who went there in the early 20th century, see how many of the structures are still in some parts buried. So you see also what weather has done over these many decades and centuries really to this site. Washington, D.C., where I have an office, has also played an interesting role. We have plaster casts that were taken from some of the monuments there in the 19th century, sent through an American ambassador back to Washington, D.C. So this one is from the so-called Palace of Darius, as we call this building, and they even had a reconstruction with a dummy of Xerxes in Washington, D.C., sitting here on a throne in a house in the Hall of the Ancients, which was a building that was not too far from the White House for about 20 years. You could see reconstructions of ancient monuments there, so it's a fascinating case study for how Persians were depicted here. Obviously, this is from the Hall of the 100 Columns, so they had even paint on them here in Washington, D.C., so Xerxes on top, and this is actually from a plaster cast that was taken from the Hall of the 100 Columns, which is today in London in the British Museum, shipped to Washington, D.C., and then painted over so that the people in Washington, D.C. had an idea how colorful everything was. I mentioned Ernst Herzfeld. Here we have him, always close associated with the German embassy in Tehran. He has been active in southwestern Iran since the early 20th century, visited for the first time in 1905 and was already overwhelmed then by what he saw. He took photographs a lot. He had a diary also where he kept his first photographs of Takht Jamshid and the royal tombs nearby. So this is a diary that is preserved here in New York in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. very interesting material to look at also. He also collected a lot of material and wrote on this material. So here we have today shards in Berlin in the museum in the storage there. Persepolis Stadtgebiet, this means Persepolis, the area of the city. So he picked up these little pieces and then brought them home. There are over 500 bags in Germany in the museums right now that he collected from this site in the 1920s mostly, before he started official excavations on the site. And we have also these stone fragments here that he collected, and they made their way through some interesting dealers today in Jerusalem in a museum. So the material that came from Herzfeld made its way throughout the world. And we have in the Smithsonian Institution pigments, wall painting fragments that I was very fortunate enough also to look at closer and study, so we can say a little bit about the structure also of these paintings and what was going on there. A lot of pottery was excavated since he started then in 1931 officially with the Chicago Oriental Institute on the site. Here we have this famous photograph that we already saw. And so he sits here among this heaps of shards. Unfortunately, not much of this was published later. There was a movie also, so for those of you who go to the Chicago Oriental Institute website, there's a YouTube video of the excavations where you can see Ernst Herzfeld running around with James Breasted and explaining to him and the sponsors actually. So one famous lady from New York, Ada Small Moore, she was involved in this. She's here seen with James Breasted from the Chicago Oriental Institute, who sponsored these excavations since 1931. And she was the one who sponsored. So Ernst Herzfeld is pretty much even on live for us still available. These are shots from his movie. So I found this one very funny here because on this one, Ernst Herzfeld, you see him finger pointing to a camel. And the inscription that you see here, which is gone today, is actually from a previous person who obviously thought that this camel is a funny, I mean, this Iranian name that we have here, Ali Akbar, is just referring to someone, obviously, who, this is Ali Akbar. So like we do when we say that you are an ass or so. I mean, so this was happening here also. So on the site of these monuments, they were later cleaned, obviously. So we also have him showing here at partly excavated structures. This is actually a tree that we have today in a paper mache that was made by Herzfeld on the site, preserved in an archive. And so we have, yeah, this is a modern paper squeeze and a photograph. Actually, he even then took photographs of these squeezes that he had, and this is today in the Metropolitan Museum. So we have plenty of trees also on the Upper Dana. I will come back to these too. And Herzfeld was watched over all the time. He is today in the New York Public Library. There's an album by a Pope who was at the same time working in Iran, Arthur Abhem Pope, and he collected about Ernst Herzfeld little scraps from a news magazine. So this scrapbook also tells us a little bit about what was going on there. In the underground places under Persepolis, there's a whole underground system. Excavations were started also under Ernst Herzfeld, and then they built a museum on the site. Here you still see actually the early tents in which Herzfeld and his team was always residing when they came to the site, and then only with the official excavations. So they started, so here are the tents, and here with this complex, which is the so-called Harem of Xerxes, which was, this is the first plan that was made of the structure, which was then turned into a museum, and is today still the main museums on the site of Persepolis. So if you go there, this is the structure. This is also where I was very fortunate enough to sleep a few nights. So in the back there, this is also used for archaeologists who work on the site, and so you can see the sunset and the sunrise from the site, which is a great experience also. So these photographs from the 1920s and 30s of Persepolis, the excavations help us quite a bit, and we learn also about first measurements that were taken also to preserve the surface and to reconstruct some of these parts there. And then it was followed after Ernst Herzfeld left and the Chicago Oriental Institute had Erich Schmidt, another German, for a few years working on the site, left by Ali Sami, who is the key person actually for everything. If you want to work on Takht Jamshid, on preservation, on the site in more detail, Ali Sami, he has become kind of a hero, really. He is, there's even a wax figure of him today in Shiraz in a museum there. Ali Sami has worked also with many foreign archaeologists, helped gave them access to the site, and then he was followed by Shabazi, who is another Iranian who was working there on the site until 1979, and he had left shortly before for Göttingen in Germany, so there are still letters preserved also from Shabazi, which are very interesting about these very late times before the Islamic Republic came over. So one building structure, the Apadana, here we have the Apadana, is one of the largest buildings that was ever constructed in the Middle East. Today, when you walk on the site, it is under a roof. So this is from last year also. So you see much of the facade is actually covered, but we have hundreds really of people depicted on this facade made out of limestone. So this is not marble, this is limestone that was quarried from nearby, and I will come back to the quarries in a second. You see also where it has been excavated by exactly the weathering of the layers. So some are more whitish today because they were for a long time under earth and water, so the others were up on the wind. So we have quite a number of delegations, around 30 delegations, and Heli spoke about them already. So one can argue always, because we don't have any inscriptions on these delegations, which delegation is predicted where, but what is striking really is the gifts that they are bringing. So some of them here indicating textiles, as you can see here. In this one, a group of what they think is from the western part of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. We have even people bringing the wool to the emperor. And so people have created a hat map based on the hat presentations also that are shown on the Apadana, from which part of the empire, which person or group was depicted where. We have also animals that are being brought and some what looks like tools today. We have vessels, these vessels or jewelry. If you look closer at them, you see fine details also that you indicate how fine the carvers then in the early 5th century BCE, late 6th century BCE, were working on these monuments. So quite remarkable details that we have. Here we have a part of the equipment brought for the king for his chair, all on the Apadana, reliefs with details of the chariot here with lions, actually very interesting details. So all of this is preserved, particularly on the eastern side of the Apadana. There's one more relief on the northern side, which has been weathered so much that is not so very well preserved. But the eastern side, excavated mostly under Ernst Herzfeld, is very well preserved. You even have Lego now. So this is the latest one that I saw as a scholar in Helsinki did a few weeks ago of the Apadana. But look at the details really of the carving. So this is what the craftsmen did here around 500 BC. From this local limestone. What I want to go with you now is a little bit to the process of the quarry and the mines to the site. This is an image here that was is of a model that was taken in Paris in the Louvre, was made there in the late 19th century. The French worked on the other side of Susa, and they had always thought about how did the workmen actually create all of these monumental palaces there. So this model, which shows some workmen, actually also there are a few standing here, you barely see them, but they were trying to understand also how were they able to put these giant stone parts on top of each other. So, and when you see again the carving here, how fine detailed, this crawl here is almost the size, half the size of this table that we are here in, and the fine carvings of all of these pieces that originally have belonged to the Apadana. Here you see another one, the crown as preserved in so much details from another building of Persepolis, and you can read really quite a lot into these carvings. So I took a lot of shots, close-up shots. We have mines, right, quarries, right next to Persepolis. So it's only about, you can walk 10 minutes and get another block there. So this limestone has also been reused in the 20th century for some of the reconstructions that were done on the site. So the people there basically could just walk, and you still see here actually how these pieces were taken out of the quarry. There are altogether 5 quarries. Some of them are pretty far away from Persepolis. You can exactly say under in which building on the site we have which quarry that was used here, and it helps you also for reconstructing some of the processes that were going on the site. Yeah. From the site itself, we do have very few tools. This is one that is not from Persepolis, but gives you an idea really how they worked with metal then. And what we've now been doing since 2006 is going with specific equipment onto the stone reliefs. So we use some portable material, and we found, for instance, on this stone relief, which is today in Berlin, it's from the Apadana, came there in the late 19th century. This is a photograph that Ernst Herzfeld took when it was already in Berlin. So what we went there in 2008 and looked at the spears and the daggers and found some really high concentration there of lead in some parts. So you see here the PB is the lead marker that indicates that on top of this limestone, this calcium, there's another layer also there of other material that was originally put on top. We think now that actually everything that was kind of a metal structure, here a dagger, this spear, had originally a much more shiny appearance than the rest of the reliefs. We see traces of paint obviously very well on some of the monuments. So this is one I took when I was on a crane in one of the tombs there, where you see the blues and the greens still very well preserved. We have, I don't know if you can see this here, this is one of the tombs north of the facade. There are traces of blue on the beard. It's very tiny here, so you barely see it in this one. But we took some more details. So there's also at Naqshi Rustam, the tomb of Darius, which is today really almost always the center of people there. You see in the inscription still the original blue that was there. So it was not the white stone on the mountain. It was totally painted over at some point. So people who would visit the site also would not get lost, and there were interpreters probably also who would help them then what is written here on this mountain, on this part. Ernst Herzfeld took a lot of paper squeezes. Here we see him actually on one inscription in Persepolis. And these squeezes are today also preserved in the Smithsonian Institution. So when I came there in 2009, it was able for me to find in these paper squeezes still traces of blue pigment that were taken out by coincidence. Herzfeld himself had never written about this, so it was they were just ending here through different journeys in Washington, D.C. And so these pigments, here you see a very close up, so indicate really what the original structures looked like. And we have, in addition to this, also pots with paint that were found in front of the monuments. So some of them are preserved in Persepolis in the museum. Others are preserved in collections around the world. I made a map here for an article that I had just published earlier this year of around the Apadana, where we have several pots with paint preserved. And some of them were only excavated about 10 years ago. So there was a recent excavation around the monument in which they found more evidence for these paint bowls and evidence for the painters at the end. So all around the structure, also on other buildings, these pots were found with traces of paint in them. And here we have some more photographs from the 1970s that are still preserved, indicating where we have pots of painters all over. This brings me briefly to Susa, where we also have quite a number of actual lapis fragments even preserved. What we saw here is not lapis in Persepolis, but at Susa, where generally the quality of the surface is much better on the glazed bricks that we have from Susa, and I will come briefly to them. there's always a higher standard of everything that was done in Susa has a much better quality than in Persepolis. The only exception is the stone. The stone monument really here from the local quarries in Persepolis is an excellent one. We have much more blues in Persepolis. This is in the storerooms. These blues, these were originally attached as horns and as ears to animals on the side. And other blues that were found also in Persepolis give us an idea that it was really this predominant color really that we see. And when I spoke earlier about Isfahan and all of these places that we see in these blue turquoise colors today. This is what I imagine actually was also the case here in Persepolis during the Achaemenid time period. So we have this predominant color and lapis, which is not only mined in Afghanistan, but there are also lapis mines in Iran, which is not very much known, but there are. So there was a team in the 1960s who who registered a number of them. So we can imagine that the worker really from these sites also went from the mine really and collected this before it was brought closer to the sites. The pigments that we see in Persepolis are mostly made out of cheaper materials. This is copper based, the so-called Egyptian blue. What we have here, I just published an article, so for those of you who are interested reading more about these painters, this is a summary of what we have there. We continued to look for traces of paint. This is with my colleagues from Berlin, from the Radken Research Laboratory. This is one of the capitals, the stone capitals that was on one of the columns there. And on a tongue, you still see this very interesting reddish color and mixed with a whitish layer. And there was an interesting article just published by an Italian team who has been doing also work on the site now. And they wrote about the finishing technique that they have evidence for bone fragments that were the main ingredient for the production of fluorapatite, a substance that was used for the whitening of the grayish limestone. Of the monuments, so there was also lots of other work that had to be involved before the paint was attached on this one. One site south of the Apadana, here I already briefly referred to the Palace of Darius, the so-called Palace of Darius here, is another interesting one. So here you have a reconstruction that was done in the 1970s by a scholar of this monument. And here in the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, there's a part of this palace that is today actually in the storage, but we were allowed a year ago to use some equipment and go over these different monuments parts that they have there. So we took measurements of the surface. We are just working on this to try to understand really what these different, I have identified different measures here also of the surface, what this actually means. But one particular one was a very interesting one. This is in the storage from the Palace of Darius, actually. So we were able, now I do not have the app, but I wanted to show you we were creating a color reconstruction. So now you can actually walk in the museum, and when you hold your this app in front of it, you see the original color. I can show it to you later in the break. So we have the equipment is for free. One can download it. How did we get to this color reconstruction? Not only because there are certain irregularities on the stone, but also because we have glazed fragments from Persepolis that were documented under Ernst Herzfeld, and some of them are also in Persepolis in the museum. We have a few fragments in Smithsonian Institution, so where we also have fragments of glazed bricks from Susa. So I was able to analyze these. So this allowed us for the color reconstruction that we have now done for the stone relief to have an almost identical theme that they had in these glazed bricks on the stone, the evidence for this. So we published another one on some glazed fragments we had analyzed already in 2016. The one on the Susa bricks that we have just done will be out early next year. So, and I also want to alert you, we have a small conference in December on the glazed bricks from Persepolis, Susa, Babylon at FIT, where I work, December 11th. So for those of you who are interested, we have a workshop how one can actually reconstruct also the process. Briefly, to another major monument on the site, the Hall of the 100 Columns. There are two bulls that are flanking this Hall of the 100 Columns here in these red arrows. One bull is preserved on the site. This is the one bull that was found in the 1930s. It was an earthquake that originally had made falling these down, and so they were buried for a long time. The other bull, however, was brought to Chicago, to the Oriental Institute, so where it is today on display in the galleries. And so Donato Bastiani, an Italian restorer, was working on this in the 1930s and 40s. And so you can directly compare also what museum environment does to a stone that is actually removed from the site. While in Persepolis, on the stone there we have plenty, oh sorry for this one also, I just want to show it's safe in Chicago. But in Persepolis, on the bull head there, you find still quite a lot of traces of paint. Here we have blue paint here. If you see these tiny little spots here, there's a little bit of red also on the eye. That was the ground layer for another color. If you zoom in closer on this blue bull, you still see several layers of paint preserved on this. And in the nostrils, we also have quite a bit of red, while on the other one in Chicago, there's not a single trace of paint left. So it was really, obviously, very heavily cleaned over these years. How do we know about the painters in Persepolis? Because we have thousands of tablets, and not only do they inform us about painters, but they also inform us about wood carvers. They inform us about masons, other masons on the site. So some particular are relevant for the painters. So we have, from the time of Darius the first, we have inscriptions from around 502 till 497 that refer to conscripted painters, decorators. That's the term that has been used by Wouter Henkelmann, who's a scholar working on many of these terms. And we have evidence for painters that is referred to in several of the tablets that were found. They're called fortification tablets because they were found near the fortification in Persepolis. And so they refer also to the place where some of the painters came from, Kaupuris, and we have even Egyptian painters that are mentioned on this, in these tablets. So we know also, at least for some of those people, where they came from. The name has been associated with a site not too far from Persepolis, actually, where some of these painters, at least, came from. So this is an ongoing project now about about the workmen from the site. We also have holes today in many of the stone monuments that were initially already in the 19th century. People saw that there must have been something in these, and there are indeed evidence for traces of gold that were initially on some of these stone reliefs. So it was not only that they carved the stone, but they also had additional material on top of them. Gold has been found on the site in numbers. So this is from a door, from a wooden door, a sheet, and then excavations under Ernst Herzfeld. He was just not on the site for this particular day, but his field colleague here, Friedrich Kräfter, another German, was discovering in the Upper Dana a deposit where they found gold and silver tablets. They are today in Tehran in the National Museum. So these actually are very deep in the basement and indicating the work that was going on the site. So gold, pretty visible. When we look at the Upper Dana today on the some of the delegations that are depicted there, we see a very interesting group actually, and I always, when you see the tall head here that is related to some of those who bring some jewelry and textiles. There are even trousers that they bring. I don't know if you can see this here, but this is a pair of trousers that are being brought to the king. And when you look now through the northeastern part of the empire, you find in tombs actually people who have from the very same time these kind of similar head dresses and also decorated with gold. So here you have more of other buildings in Persepolis that show textiles are being worn. So it's really kind of a, like Heli already mentioned, it is a kind of a really interesting story that you have here both the people wearing different dresses, and also bringing costumes to the king, even sheep, probably for the wool that was used for producing these textiles. So briefly, before I finish, I want to go to one site, Bagh Feruzi, that has been quite in the news for the last couple of years. From Persepolis, from the Takht Jamshid site, it's quite a bit of a ride actually today. So there's a particular site called Tol-e Ajori in the site, which, so here again, we have Bagh Feruzi. And on this site, Tol-e Ajori is the modern site name, a small little elevation there that was already in the 1950s under an Italian team quickly surveyed when they found brick fragments on the site. And so what they did now since 2012 was starting an excavation on the site, and what they found were layers that show an entire gate made of brick stones that have also glazed brick facades on the one side. So we know there's now an entrance gate also that is quite in distance to these palatial buildings on the platform. Alireza Askari-Chaverdi, who's the Iranian colleague from the University of Shiraz, who's excavating this site, has published together with the Italian colleagues who are working on this site quite a bit already. And we have marks on these here that indicate also the layer fitters marks, actually where on which part a particular brick stone is resting. So here you see they were added in white paint also by these people back then. Here you see a closer up. So these colleagues there are constantly working now on this and trying to improve our understanding of these glazed bricks, which are today in Persepolis in the museum also, and they have even flower decoration. So it comes really very close to what we have from the other sites in Susa and in Babylon. So in the reconstruction that were published already by the Iranian-Italian team, you see that we have bulls and we have the famous Mushchushu, which we have also at the Ishtar Gate in Babylon. So it seems that there's now an indication that people there started with Cyrus already before coming to Babylon, to all of these other places, that workmen were then either taken or they were somehow asked to train local people in Fars, in Persepolis, to work on this. I want to end and thank everyone who has helped me also so far. In Iran, there's a fantastic team really there of Iranians who take very well care of the site. I have been every summer that I've been working there really very well welcomed by them, and they are open really for research also on the site. So in this interest, I want to make sure also let's keep friendship with Iran. I mean, the people really, they are our friends. We want to, of course, also make sure that the site is preserved for the future. So I want to thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions, of course, obviously. Thank you.
Now for something completely different. Thank you very much to the organizers for the kind invitation to join in on this. Ladies and gentlemen and colleagues and friends, when we think of the many amazing monuments that have survived from pre-Islamic Iran, it becomes clear that no site has received more attention from Western observers than Persepolis, the Persian capital founded by Darius I around 520 BC. The site as it appears today, and as you've just seen, is certainly impressive, with its many residential, reception, and administrative buildings, all of which sit atop a massive platform about 300 by 455 meters and 12 meters high, made of thousands of tons of stone. And although the appearance of Persepolis today owes much to excavation undertaken in the 20th century, as Alex just said, by Herzfeld and Schmidt and Ali Sami, it has never been entirely buried by debris, in spite of the best efforts of Alexander and his army to destroy it. We know this not only because of the many views of the site published from the 17th century onwards, long before any excavations took place, but also from inscriptions dating the late antiquity and the early medieval era on the ruins of buildings that were never entirely buried by debris. The earliest such inscription, written in Middle Persian, dates to the year 311 AD, roughly 600 years or so after the burning of Persepolis by the Macedonian army. Inscribed on a doorframe that stands to this day, the inscription records a visit by Shapur, the Sakhan Shah, the ruler of the Sakha, or Sistan, the province, son of Urmaz II, the reigning king, Shahanshah, of the Sasanian Empire, who stopped for a meal at Persepolis while traveling back to eastern Iran, where he was the governor, as it were, having visited his father. The text, as you can see here, part of the translation, clearly shows that Shapur had no idea who had built Persepolis or how old it was, but he did want to call forth blessings on his ancestors. Another example of such royal graffiti was left much later by Adud al-Dawla, a king of the Buyid dynasty, who, when he visited Persepolis in 955-56, ordered that someone be found who could read the inscriptions visible on the ruins of the site. It is certain that nobody living in the 10th century could have read the Achaemenid inscriptions written in cuneiform, whether in Elamite, Babylonian, or Old Persian. But scribes or government secretaries, many of whom were Zoroastrians, could read Middle Persian, the liturgical language of Zoroastrianism, and the language used by Shapur in the text we just saw. In fact, a second inscription left by Adud al-Dawla shows us that indeed 2 literate men were found who presumably read the Middle Persian text of Shapur. One of these literati was named Marasfand al-Mobad, that is, priest, Mobad being a Zoroastrian priest, al-Khazaruni, from Khazarun, a town located south of Persepolis, not far from the Persian Gulf, that still bears this name. As I noted a moment ago, by the time Shapur had his graffito written in the early 4th century AD, the identity of the original builders of Persepolis was unknown, and with the passage of time, the Achaemenid Empire passed into the realm of myth. Around 999 AD, the great Persian poet Ferdowsi completed his Book of Kings, or Shahnameh, and there Persepolis is called Takht-i Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid, one of the early and most illustrious mythical rulers of the Persians, a figure often conflated with Solomon in the Hebrew Bible. The first known European visitor to the site was the Franciscan friar Odoric of Pordenone, who visited Persepolis in 1330. Odoric mistakenly thought its inhabitants had fought with the Romans rather than Alexander and his Macedonians. However, although he called the site Comarum and exaggerated its size, the description of its walls and palaces given by Odoric has been taken by most commentators to apply to Persepolis. Almost a century and a half passed before another European visitor that we know of, the Venetian ambassador Josapha Barbaro. Barbaro began his eastern journey in 1436 and published an account of his travels in 1467. He called the site Chilminar, which is an easily recognizable transliteration of Persian Chehelminar, meaning 40 columns, a common colloquial name for Persepolis. Barbaro described the monumental columns, 20 yards tall and so thick that it took 3 men to wrap their arms around them. He also described what he called an image like unto that we resemble to God the Father in a circle, which clearly corresponds to the figure of Ahura Mazda, the great god of Zoroastrianism and titular deity of the Persian Achaemenid dynasty, one rendering of which you see here, but there are many at Persepolis and on seals and other media. At the time of Barbaro's visit, Fars province, where Persepolis is located, was under the control of the Akkuyunlu Confederation. a Turkmen group who created a tribal empire which lasted only a few decades. In 1476, Sultan Khalil, son of the Akyunlu ruler Uzun Hasan, visited the site. His court poet, Davani, says that Sultan Khalil, quote, gave orders to Prince Abul Ma'ali Sultan Ali Mirza, a great expert in calligraphy, to carve a few lines of appropriate poetry on one of the buildings at Persepolis. Amazingly, the lines that Sultan Khalil had engraved were copied almost 2 centuries later by the English East India Company agent Samuel Flower when he visited the site in 1667 and published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society in London, as you see here, there in the middle with the red box around it. In 1618, Don Garcia de Silva y Figueroa, ambassador of Philip III, king of the Spanish monarchy, to the Safavid ruler Shah Abbas I, visited Persepolis, where he copied several cuneiform signs you see on the upper right there. Because these were not included in the Dutch diplomat Abraham de Vicfort's 1667 French translation of Don Garcia's travel account, and were only published in the Comentarios volume, shown on your right in 1903, they do not rank as the first published cuneiform from the site. Moreover, it's important to realize that the signs shown do not represent an actual inscription, but were rather copies of random signs from different inscriptions at the site that Don Garcia saw. Don Garcia's original manuscript in the National Library of Madrid, 2 pages of which you see at the top of the slide, also contains a dozen drawings, probably made by Don Garcia's secretary. Although not the work of a very competent draftsman, the drawings are nonetheless faithful enough to enable us to identify with little difficulty the actual reliefs in question, such as this famous one showing a seated king, variously identified by scholars as either Darius with Xerxes, his crown prince, standing behind him, or Xerxes with Artaxerxes I. Similarly, this drawing of a Persian courtier or usher holding a baton or walking stick and wearing the so-called Elamite dagger with its distinctive grip at his waist is a figure represented many times at Persepolis. In 1621, the Italian traveler Pietro della Valle visited Persepolis and later wrote an enormously influential account of his travels, which included a description of the site. In fact, the fanciful drawing of what looks like a door frame with oversized Old Persian cuneiform, again composed of random signs rather than an actual inscription, was the first cuneiform ever published in the West. Della Valle was the first in a long line of travelers who reported more extensively on Persepolis. 5 years after his visit, in 1626, Thomas Herbert, only 21 at the time, accompanied the embassy led by Sir Dodmore Cotton, which Charles I sent to Shah Abbas I with the task of negotiating a trade agreement between England and the Safavid Empire. 7 years later, Herbert published an account of his journey and experiences, which generations of historians have praised for its spontaneity and acute perspective. Fully 40 years after that, Herbert brought out a revised and expanded version of his book, less well received by modern historians because of the fact that it is much more studied and embellished, but of greater interest to us as it includes a long account of Herbert's visit to both Persepolis and Pasargadae, Cyrus the Great's capital. Herbert devoted over 13 pages of closely printed text to a lengthy discussion of what he saw, and his work incorporates a very learned discussion of what the ancient sources had to say about Persepolis and the Persian Empire more generally, clearly the product of study and research conducted after his return to England. He too copied some random cuneiform signs, and in addition to consulting all of the relevant classical sources, he also mentions, as we see at the end of this excerpt from his text, that he used Ferrari's Epitome Geographicum, a famous lexicon of place names in classical sources that was first published in 1605 and appeared in a revised form in 1627 as the Lexicon Geographicum. In 1636, Friedrich III, Duke of Schleswig-Holstein-Gottorp, whom you see here, sent a trading mission to Iran. An ambitious and highly capable ruler who had already dispatched a delegation to Russia to explore the possibility of importing luxury goods from the East without the necessity of crossing the Ottoman Empire. The Duke lived on a sumptuous estate in northern Germany, about a 40-minute drive from Kiel, which you see here. Nice place. The delegation sent to Iran included two members whose publications have remained of enormous interest since their first appearance, namely the mathematician and Orientalist Adam Oelschläger, better known by his Latinized surname Olearius, as secretary, and Johann Albrecht von Mandelsloh, a 17-year-old nobleman. Although the account of the mission published by Olearius in 1647 is important for the light it sheds on contemporary conditions in Iran, that of his younger colleague Mandelsloh is of greater interest for us, as it reports, among other things, on a visit to Persepolis made on 27 January 1638. Published posthumously by Olearius 14 years after Mandelsloh's death, and incorporating content cribbed from Thomas Herbert's earlier account, the Morgenländische Reisebeschreibung nevertheless did include a particularly interesting detail, namely that when Mandelsloh visited Persepolis, 19 columns in the Apadana, or audience hall of Darius the Great, were still standing. And people have looked at this and used this and compared to later eyewitness accounts to see how the progress of the falling of the standing columns at Persepolis has proceeded. In 1649, the Dutch East India Company sent Johan Cuneus as ambassador to the court of Shah Abbas II in Isfahan. Both the Dutch and the English after them were mainly interested in acquiring Persian silk, which they transported overland from the Safavid capital Isfahan to Bandar Abbas, then called Gambroon, on the Persian Gulf, whence it was loaded onto vessels bound for India, and from there shipped back either to the Netherlands or eventually to England. 19-year-old Cornelis Jansson Spielmann accompanied Cuneus as his secretary. In 1908, Spielmann's journal was published by the Dutch businessman Albertus Hotz, who spent 30 years working in Iran and knew the country intimately. Spielmann's observations were very detailed. He noted the heights and diameters of columns, how many steps were preserved in various staircases, the dimensions of buildings, and so forth, giving much more precise information than any of his predecessors, although, as noted, Spielmann's diary was only published centuries after the fact and contained, unfortunately, neither drawings nor plans of what he saw. The next important visitor to Persepolis was the Frenchman Jean de Thévenot. Thévenot had already traveled extensively throughout the eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, and Sinai between 1656 and 1659, and he's even credited with having introduced coffee to Paris. After publishing a first volume on his travels, he set off for India via Iran in 1663. Fluent in Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, Thévenot is highly regarded for his accurate portrayal of Persian daily life and institutions. Although he died on his return at the age of only 34, his work was published posthumously in 1674. On his visit to Persepolis, Thévenot was accompanied by the French gem merchant Jean-Baptiste Tavernier. Tavernier openly expressed his disdain for the ruins of Persepolis, but he had in his service the Dutch artist Philips Angel II of Leiden, who had gone to Iran in 1651 as part of a Dutch East India Company delegation expressly to teach Shah Abbas II to draw. Angel spent 8 days at Persepolis, and it has been suggested that this was done at the behest of Shah Abbas II, who wanted him to document the ruins there. The view of Persepolis that you see here, published in François Valentin's Old and New East India in 1726, was done by Angel, although for many years it was wrongly attributed to another Dutchman, Herbert de Jager, who worked for the Dutch East India Company also in Iran between 1665 and 1670, and again from 1684 to 1687. As mentioned earlier, the English East India Company agent Samuel Flower visited Persepolis in 1667. In addition to copying the inscription commissioned by Sultan Khalil that I discussed before from 1476, he also copied the random cuneiform signs at the bottom of this plate, just as Don Garcia de Silva y Figueroa and Pietro della Valle had done before him. These, however, were not published until 1694, more than 70 years after Pietro della Valle had gotten the credit for being the first to publish cuneiform signs from the site. Herbert de Jager's work at Persepolis, alluded to a moment ago, has also survived. In 1691, Nicholas Witsen, mayor of Amsterdam and a Dutch East India Company officer, sent these 2 drawings of Persepolis by de Jager to the Royal Society in London, one showing the approach to the site from the north, looking south, from the south looking north, and the other an oblique bird's-eye view from the north looking south. In 1694, these were published in the Royal Society's journal, Philosophical Transactions, with a preamble by the editor who justified their publication by noting that, quote, little of those famous remains having yet been published, and those that have been but ill-designed or graved. In other words, what had appeared had not been terribly accurate up to that time. In 1672, March of 1672, another Dutchman, Jan Janssen Struys, visited Persepolis. A sailmaker by profession, he ran away from home and made 3 adventurous voyages, the first of which took him to Iran. His illustration of the so-called royal tomb of Persepolis shows a highly fanciful building with multiple domes, bedecked with garlands, and the only kernels of truth in it seem to be the raised platform on which the whole architectural ensemble is sited, and the freestanding columns, which at least bear some resemblance to reality. In a 2008 study, the Dutch scholar Kees Butterblom wrote, quote, wholly unexpected from an unsophisticated sailor, classical Greek authorities are invoked in the Reisen, the book by Struys. These erudite references reveal a ghostwriter, well-versed in the classics, and it may be that the embellished image of Persepolis, vigorously criticized by Jean Chardin, owes something to either Struys's publisher or the putative ghostwriter. Chardin, a French Huguenot jeweler who first visited Iran in 1666, was commissioned by Shah Abbas II to purchase jewels for him, and he spent 4 years, from 1673 to 1677, in the Safavid capital, Isfahan. His multi-volume travel account was highly praised by such Enlightenment luminaries as Gibbon, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. Although he published no drawings of the site, Chardin made a memorable statement about it, noting that nothing was easier than reading the physical plan of Persepolis, thanks to the accurate descriptions of it by Arrian, Quintus Curtius, and Diodorus Siculus, and he expressed unqualified pleasure at traveling the countryside with copies of these ancient authors to hand. Roughly 2 years after Struys, in July 1674, 25-year-old Ambrosio Bembo arrived at Persepolis. Bembo was a young Venetian nobleman whose family palazzo you see on your left. In 1669, at the age of 17, he fought in Venice's naval war against the Ottomans, serving under his relatives Taddeo Morosini, commander of the Venetian Navy, and Taddeo's brother Francesco Morosini, commander-in-chief of all the Venetian forces, and later Doge of Venice. When Bembo's uncle Marco was appointed Venetian consul in Aleppo, he invited Ambrosio to accompany him to Syria, and thus began the peregrinations that would take him all the way to India and back. The existence of Bembo's diary was not known until 1803, when Jacopo Morelli, librarian of St. Mark's Cathedral, published excerpts of it in his dissertation on the journeys of, quote, some erudite Venetians. The diary was acquired by the Rare Book Library at the University of Minnesota in 1964. And in 2007, it was published in English translation by the Safavid and Mughal art historian Anthony Welch. What makes Bembo's journal of particular interest in this instance is not so much the text, which is very terse on the subject of Persepolis, but rather the illustrations accompanying it. When Bembo was in Isfahan, he met Jean Chardin, the French jeweler I mentioned a moment ago. Chardin was already known for his eyewitness account of the coronation of the Safavid Shah Suleiman, and he was, by all accounts, both a haughty and a devious man. Chardin had employed the French artist Guillaume Joseph Grelot to illustrate what would be his magnum opus, Voyage de Monsieur le Chevalier Chardin en Perse, published in 4 volumes. But when Bembo met Grelot, he was suffering under a stringent contract that made him surrender all rights to his drawings to his patron Chardin, imposing harsh penalties if he didn't finish the job or if the drawings weren't up to scratch, and withholding all payment until Chardin and Grelot returned safely to Paris. Needing an artist himself, Bembo managed to lure Grelot away, in part because he offered to pay his return passage to Paris, something Chardin was unwilling to do. Grelot himself eventually published an important work on Constantinople, but the drawing you see here of Persepolis was a composite made on the basis of both Grelot's and Bembo's recollections and pencil sketches drawn during their visits to the site. Grelot's pencil drawing of the tomb of Artaxerxes at Persepolis, Artaxerxes II, which you see here, is clearly the precursor of the engraving on your right that appeared in Chardin's Voyage en Perse in 1711. Along with other drawings published by Chardin, this confirms that despite their contretemps, Grelot nevertheless did fulfill his contractual obligations to Chardin. In late March 1684, the German physician Engelbert Kempfer, who had settled in Sweden in 1681, arrived in the Safavid capital Isfahan with a Swedish delegation sent to investigate potential Eastern trade. There he spent the next 20 months, proving himself an acute observer of all aspects of Persian society. When the Swedish delegation departed, Kempfer stayed on, eventually taking up a position as surgeon with the Dutch East India Company. Before beginning his duties at Gambroon, or modern Bandar Abbas on the Persian Gulf, Kempfer spent 3 days in early December 1685 studying the ruins of Persepolis. Although a medical man by profession, Kempfer's drafting ability was considerable. In 1710, his book, Ammonitatum Exoticarum, which may be translated as Exotic Delights, was published, containing an important series of images of Persepolis. In fact, in the lower left-hand corner of the view shown here, we see Kempfer himself sketching the ruins while his servant holds his horse. Kempfer's work contains a number of features to which none of his predecessors could lay claim, such as a true bird's-eye view, which you see here, showing the disposition of the buildings and columns on the terrace at Persepolis. The spatial relationship between the buildings and their state of preservation is shown here in a more isometric view, again with the figure of Kempfer himself shown drawing in the foreground. In this case, the outlook is from the high hill, the Kui Ramat, which delimits the site on its north side, looking south just above the tomb of Artaxerxes II that we saw a moment ago. Nevertheless, Kempfer was criticized by several later writers, later visitors to the site, who considered his drawings highly inaccurate. However, much of the inaccuracy seen in the published engravings can be attributed to his engraver, A.W. Branshagen, who worked, not very well it seems, from Kempfer's original pencil drawings. In fact, Kempfer openly complained about this, about Branshagen's clumsiness in the introduction to his book, Immunitatem. This clumsiness is perhaps most evident in the rendering of Kempfer's figural drawings, an example of which you see here on the left. The stairways leading to the main audience hall at Persepolis are adorned with registers of gift or tribute bearers from the various satrapies of the empire. Kempfer's drawing, however, is a composite, since nowhere on the site do so many registers of figures appear superimposed one above the other. Nevertheless, if we consider the images in detail, we can easily recognize what Kempfer or Branshagen was trying to depict. If we take, for example, the often repeated motif of the lion attacking a bull, we see that the artist has completely reoriented the bull, at the same time making it into something that resembles a long-eared mule or donkey, while the body of the attacking lion is raised completely off the ground, as if in the act of leaping on its prey. Whereas, in fact, as the photograph of the image shows, the lion's rear legs are firmly planted on the ground, and the bull's body is oriented in the opposite direction, with its head turned toward the rear. Another example of distortion can be seen in the middle register, where the artist has turned a two-humped Bactrian camel, seen in the photo, into a one-humped dromedary, and seriously altered the gift bearers in front of it, just as he has taken liberties with the delegation accompanying what appears as an emaciated, humped, or zebu bull in the register below. Here, too, the delegation advancing in front of the zebu wear clearly cone-shaped hats with long tassels. The artist has the tassels, but otherwise has completely distorted the headgear. The most outspoken critic of the Kempfer-Branshagen etchings was the Dutch artist Cornelis de Bruyn, also known in French as Corneille Lebrun. Several years after Kempfer's work appeared, de Bruyn published a critique of both Chardin's, that is Grelot's, and Kempfer's, Branshagen's, illustrations of Persepolis. Arguably the most important and, artistically speaking, highly trained of the 17th and 18th century visitors to Persepolis, de Bruyn was both a skilled painter-draftsman and an avid traveler. After studying with Theodor van der Schoor in The Hague, de Bruyn caught the attention of Nicholas Witsen, the mayor of Amsterdam and Dutch East India Company official, who, as mentioned earlier, later sent Herbert de Jager's drawings to the Royal Society in London. Witsen has been called by his biographer, Marion Peters, as the Mercator Sapiens par excellence, the wise merchant who seeks counsel in science to benefit his business. Witsen financed de Bruyn's first decade-long trip, encompassing 4 years in Italy and 6 in Turkey and Egypt. De Bruyn then returned to Italy, studying painting in Venice for 8 years with the prolific German artist Johann Karl Loth, who eventually rose to become court painter of the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I. De Bruyn returned then to The Hague in 1693 and spent the next 5 years preparing his first travel book, published in 1698, which you see here. In 1701, he left on a second journey, lasting more than 7 years, to Russia, Iran, and Southeast Asia. Again, Witsen financed the journey, ostensibly because of the Dutch East India Company commercial interests in Russia. De Bruyn arrived in Iran on July 21st, 1703, and stayed for nearly a year, during which time he met the last Safavid ruler of Iran, Shah Sultan Hussein. The book which resulted from this journey, first published in Dutch in 1711, did not add anything particularly novel by way of descriptions of Persian life, but the 320 engravings that it contained were a major achievement and displayed de Bruyn's skill to great effect. To start with one example of his accuracy, I've here juxtaposed De Bruyn's drawing of a relief showing the procession of gift bearers and the lion-bull combat motif that I mentioned a moment ago in discussing Kempfer, with a photo of that combat scene and a detail of Brunshagen's highly inaccurate rendering of the same. Or consider the perspective of the view shown here, which is almost photographic in its depiction of the terrace at Persepolis. Moreover, if you look at the detail of the structure with the two human-headed winged bulls, or lamassu, identified by the cuneiform inscription on it as the Gate of All Nations, the grand portal constructed by Xerxes in the 5th century BC, through which all of the delegations visiting Persepolis must have passed after climbing the stairs to the terrace, you can see just how accurate a draftsman he was. And this, by the way, is where De Bruyn carved his name and the date, 1704, of his visit. All in all, the engravings of Cornelis de Bruyn surpassed the quality of anything done at Persepolis prior to the 19th century. They gave European readers a clear, realistic impression of the ruins of the palaces and audience halls of Darius the Great, his son Xerxes, and his grandson Artaxerxes I. Thanks to De Bruyn, Persepolis moved from the realm of the fabulous to the real, and long before the age of photography, European readers were afforded an accurate rendering of its many remarkable monuments. Thank you for your attention.